this webinar on post-COVID-19 world order, challenges and strategies, which the Pakistan Institute of International Affairs is organizing this morning. I welcome everybody on board and I'm grateful for your presence. We have chosen this topic, post-COVID-19 world order, challenges and strategies, because as you all know, COVID-19 has turned our world upside down. It has undermined what we consider as normal, or what we have been considering as normal so far. So as we wait for the new normal to emerge, whatever it will be, we should get together and discuss what is likely to happen on the world stage in the future. What will be the relationship between states as and when the pandemic recedes, if it does recede? What will be the fate of alliances, of multilateral institutions, of other world bodies? But my concern is also about what is going to happen to the people of this world, communities and families and individuals and marginalized groups, minorities, refugees, women, and even the poor children of the COVID generation. And to discuss this, we have a panel of 4 eminent persons: Dr. Nausheen Wasi, Dr. Rabia Akhtar, Mr. Javed, Jabbar, and Hina Jilani Saiba. We'll start with Nausheen. I'd be grateful if the panelists would take 15 minutes and no more, because we want to give time to the question and answer session. Nausheen Wasi is Assistant Professor in the Department of International Relations at the University of Karachi. She started her formal career at this institute as a research scholar, and then she moved out to the University of Karachi, where she has distinguished herself as a teacher, a researcher, and an author. She has many works of writing, authorship to her credit, and she is going to speak today on post-COVID-19 scenario, moving towards a fragmented world. Nausheen.
Thank you very much, Dr. Masooma. It's a sheer delight for me to be part of this panelist and to speak from this forum that I consider my home. Thank you very much. Dr. Khalid, may I get the sharing option? I wish to begin with my presentation, PowerPoint presentation. You see? Thank you very much. So you see, let me begin my presentation with certain notes as we talk about the COVID-19 and the post-COVID-19 world politics today. There have been almost 49.1 million people affected with this virus. Fortunately, the mortality rate has been low. 32.3 million have recovered, and we have witnessed 1.24 million deaths, which is also a great number. And the worrisome fact is that when we are almost a year with this pandemic in the world, countries around the world who have not come out of the shock of the first wave are battling against the resurgence of the violence. And the worst week has been in the United States, where on daily basis we have been witnessing 80 to 100,000 more cases every day. The second measures in terms of imposing lockdowns have begun in part of Europe, and many other countries are considering the options. Countries across, the known is already countries across the globe hit by the economic fallout suffered the same way. Although states' capacity and level of economic inequalities define the level of success in handling with the impact but every country was faced with the same kind of crisis. It's what is startling for me is that its impact on the rich world is new. The kind of the way crisis, economic crisis hit the states, and especially people were in need of the daily necessities. Especially, we saw long queues outside the departmental stores in Europe and the very wealthy society of United States as well. You see, to deal with in an academic way, like any crisis, this pandemic saga raised many questions. And we actually began to respond to the crisis with certain set of questions, like how to manage the situation. The first question that policymakers in Gulf is the management of the crisis. Who deserves help? Who is responsible? Who do we trust, especially when we are dealing with the kind of crisis that this pandemic has unleashed? And especially, you see, pandemic is a health crisis. But when we talked about the pandemic responses in the world, specifically, and from being from the field we are in, we are more concerned with the political outcome of the pandemic, and especially why the world was taken by surprise with this pandemic is because of the economic fallout. The measures those were taken to handle this crisis. Why? In the absence of cure or drug vaccine, social distancing and lockdowns were the only available option. Lockdowns have been a very traditional mode of dealing with the pandemic like situation when the drug is not invented or the vaccine to deal with the virus is not invented. The second set of question was who deserves help? Of course, the rational question is people. Obviously, it is life of the individual that matters and that need to be saved. But you see, there are many threats to the security of an individual and to the security of the state. And in this kind of crisis, where we suddenly felt helpless, we felt helpless in a sense that economic fallout of the lockdown was very severe, the kind of the world we were living in. So every country and at a global level too, it was a hard choice for states and institutions between life and livelihood. And this resurfaced the debate between right and left wing of politics. So though it led to many problems, it led to a set of hope as well that the world economic order might be reshaping. This crisis would lead to rethinking of the security dynamics that happened. Then the third set of questions that raised hue and cry was associated with the responsibility factor. Who is the responsible for this crisis? We saw lots of dispute about the exact origin of the virus, and the blame game began. China blamed United States for throwing this virus. United States President called it the Chinese virus made in the Wuhan laboratories, etc., etc. And you see, then WHO was blamed uh, uh, for responding slow on the crisis, at times taking the Chinese side, etc., etc. So all the other institutions, those were to come to take the lead, were fall short of expectations of the people. Then in that circumstances, who do we trust? We saw the absolute leadership crisis as far as dealing with this pandemic is concerned. States, global and regional institutions have been found wanting in their responses in terms of handling health emergencies. Health emergencies, and then the negative fallout of the economic measures or the different measures that were taken to control the pandemic spread, virus spread. In March, obviously, WHO called the virus causing pandemic in the world. But you see, and then many fragmentations that we saw as a result of answering these questions or handling with these questions or addressing these questions surfaced the fragmentation of politics in the world. In the absence of any leadership any proper policies from the institutions, those were responsible to take the lead. In the absence of proper responses from there, many different things emerged, and especially we saw the end of the myth of international community that we have been talking about for long. We saw the growth of nationalism, populism, and intolerance. But how do I see this situation? Every fragmentation that we witnessed, that resurfaced by this pandemic, is attributed to the pandemic outcome. But to me, this is not the case. Pandemic did not lead to fragmentation. My assumption is, my argument is that it is the vice versa. It is the vice versa. In fact, the fragmentation in international politics led to this pandemic. Why? I strongly believe, I am inside of the people, the science journalists who talked about that pandemic was anything but predictable and preventable. You see, since the outbreak of SARS in 2002, there have been constant warnings by the health organizations, by the scientists, that a new pandemic is just around the corner. And still today, when we talked about the responses and the response mechanism to deal with this pandemic, and we are still battling with the fallout we had in the world, we run the risk of the next pandemic, and that has been more frequent. So these warnings have been there over the period of time. And even in 2008, the United States was given this suggestion that the world must do something to control the spread of a virus that might take place anytime. And in fact, they gave the period whereby the new virus can emerge. So when this virus emerged in Wuhan in late November, first China denied the news, tried to carpet the news. Later it became apparent because it traveled to the other states. And it was soon identified with the same family of viruses that were identified in 2002. You see, as lockdowns have been the traditional measure for centuries, this lockdown was imposed in 2002 as well. But and its negative impact was noticeable, but it was ignored because of many factors. Why? If we, you see, international political system have taken many shifts during the past centuries. If we talked about the present or the contemporary politics after the end of the Second World War, we have seen many shifts in political atmosphere of the world. Cold War politics was associated with different set of features. Realism was the dominating aspect of the international dealing. My assumption is, my argument is that it has always been with varying degree of significance. But after the end of the Cold War, two important features started dominating the world's political agenda. One was the globalization, and second was the salience of non-traditional security problems and imbalanced development. So globalization was an important factor whereby the mode of communication, advancements in the mode of communication was connecting the world to an extent that was never witnessed in the world. And the second set of problem, non-traditional security problems, became important because of this globalization and the result of globalization. Globalization, like every phenomena, it also had positive and negative impact. So many different kind of problems surfaced during the post-Cold War period. Why? Just have a look on this. Globalization promoted the economic development, technological progress, flow of information and people, and also the transparency of government in many countries and regions. It was said that economic cooperation among countries reduces the danger of war and increases the cost for political conflict. So if countries knit together in the framework that was being propagated at that time, it is going to reduce the chances of conflict in the world. And after the Cold War, you see, when President Bush announced the New World Order, the different kind of securities, insecurities or the security problems took the lead. So you see, security started being discussed as an inclusive term, and this inclusive nature of security was given prominence. At the same time, along with the economic growth and accumulating of material wealth comes the rapid growth of consumption of energy and other natural resources, environmental degradation, the excessive concentration of wealth, as well as the exacerbated economic inequality and other complicated social conflicts brought by the rapid circulation of capital and human resources. With uh, equal attention was given in the scholarly circle on these problems. There was continuous research on this set of problems, but that did not become the priority agenda for the countries to whom traditional security continue to dominate their policy options. Then non-traditional security problems that became important. Scholars talked about it. Different policy institutions talked about it. We talked about financial instability, food shortage, energy shortage, pollution, climate change, illegal immigration, transnational crimes, terrorism, epidemic diseases, and product safety. They became the current agenda of world politics. So when we talked about the important political trends in the post-Cold War period, actually inequality and to deal with the imbalanced development found the important place in the institutional agendas. United Nations came up with SDGs. We talked about how to handle the conflict so as to inclusive nature of security could be focused, etc. It was on the agenda at least. And there was hope that in a due course of time, since world was moving from one episode to another, after the end of the Cold War, all these issues formed the discussions agendas. And since the world was in transition, was considered in transition, it was hoped that after some time when the world settles, these issues will gain prominence. 9/11 changed the course of the politics. And again, these policy agendas were overshadowed by the new set of politics that emerged in the post 9/11 scenario. And we saw the more fragmentation of more fragmentation at global level, at a state level. People were states were following a dominant agenda of finding their sphere of influence in the world. So, despite repeated calls from experts, social leaders, and advocacy groups to address the issues of environmental degradation, global warming, population growth, rampant urbanization, and social inequalities, they have not become operational priority areas of a state, which continue to define security in the traditional fashion, as I just talked about. So what happened in this situation came the pandemic. So when I say that pandemic was all predictable and preventable, had policymakers, had institutions, had states given priority to these calls, we were not be in the situation we are today. So when this pandemic broke out, scholars again talked about having a new set of political agendas or the need to have a new sort of political agendas in the government's priority list. There were trepidation, of course, that has been the case in any pandemic like situation or the any crisis like situation. At the same time, there was hope that this pandemic would be an eye opener, and this would lead states to give priority to the problems that demand pressing that demand actions, prompt actions, continued actions, collaborated actions. But this didn't happen. And even at that time, I was cautious because I did not believe that change comes abruptly with different events like of the magnitude like 9/11 or the pandemic led subsequent developments in the world. Because you see, it is the result of evolutionary process. So what we have been witnessing in the states policy is indicative that states in a mid-term or long-term basis are not going to give priority to these areas. And this basically leads us towards the conclusion that world is moving towards a fragmented order. Yes, the world is moving towards a fragmented order, but I do not think that it is because of the pandemic. Pandemic perhaps defined this fragmentation and a way that was not being understood. And I would not, even when I say that it was not being understood, I'm cautious because it is understood, but it is not in the interest of the uh, policy framers who see different goals for the survival. Then, because of that factor, we saw many conspiracy theories emerging. You see, the kind of inequalities that were taking root with this increased globalization, with this new economic technologies, with this with the growth of artificial intelligence related technologies. You see, this is bound to lead the inequality in the world, and all the conspiracy set was to address this case that the framer of the world, the mover and shakers of the world, want to make the world for the fittest. And so such
Nausheen,
kind
I
of
think you should wind up.
definitely, madam. So I'll come towards the end. Conspiracy is that the framer of the world wants to shape the world for the fittest. So what we see when I say that we will continue to have the fragmented order because of the situation that we see in different regions of the world. So I will not go into the detail how this period is defining the future international politics. We have witnessing the beginning of the perhaps the beginning of the end of the West as we know it. Because you see, I will not go into details. We all know about the Brexit episode. US, UK after Brexit are planning to have free trade agreement and special military alliances, because of which Germany and France are developing their own agendas, though they are still under the American dominance because they are economically dependent on America. But still, we see the West splitting on certain issues. Economic inequalities intensify not only among regions but within regions and states, and subsequently, state makes nationalist choices. So that would be out of necessities. Even if we talked about Europe, there is a marked inequalities between North and South Europe. So ultimately, every country is coming up with different options. Being in geopolitical battle with China and Russia, US demand EU should not buy energy from Russia and technology from China. And there have been pressure on different countries in the world not to side with China. That is creating a new kind of alliances. The new Eurasia is emerging with
Thank
China
you.
and Russia as its leader. So you see, every region at present appears to be in disarray, and that is why we won't see any collaborative response in near future. Thank you.
Thank
I
you.
end here, then we'll take in QA session.
Thank you very much, Nausheen. Thank you for this analysis. The next speaker is Dr. Rabia Akhtar. She is the director of the Center for Security, Strategy and Policy Research at the University of Lahore. She is also a member of the Prime Minister's Advisory Council on Foreign Affairs. Rabia has spoken at seminars before. She is also the editor of Politico and the author of The Blind Eye, US Non-Proliferation Policy Towards Pakistan from Ford to Clinton. Rabia will speak on combating COVID-19 by advanced technologies, need for global cooperation. Rabia, 15 मिनट ले लीजिएगा, please.
Thank you so much. I'd like to thank Ambassador Masuma Hassan and Dr. Tanveer Khalid for inviting me to be part of this August panel on this extremely important topic, which is affecting all of us almost on daily basis. First, a disclaimer: I'm not, an IT or AI specialist, but because all of this affects us, so I have a personal interest in reading on this issue. So since December 2019, we have found ourselves in an unprecedented situation with respect to the pandemic. This situation has pushed the world to find solutions in technology, and we have seen that technology has come to the rescue and is critical in providing solutions to countries across the globe to find effective solutions to deal with this outbreak. But access to this technology has not been uniform across the globe, and that is where global cooperation needs to happen, especially with those communities that are digitally isolated. One very basic example is access to internet. Since work from home and virtual learning systems have become the new norm, but in communities where access to internet is not uniform across Pakistan and I'm sorry, you lost me there for a while.
It's okay now.
We can
Now
hear
we
you
can
All
hear
now.
you. Now we
right.
can
Okay.
hear you.
Okay. So, since work from home and virtual learning systems have become the new norm, but in communities where access to internet is minimal or it does not exist in some cases, this digital divide created due to this
Aja,
disadvantage become the
Aja.
new form of, and we need to recognize that. We have seen this happen with students who live in remote areas with no access to internet and have had to freeze their semesters and sit at home with no hope in sight. And I,
सुनो
belonging to an educational
ये
institution,
रजा
have seen students suffer where access to internet is not uniform across Pakistan and communities and provinces. We have had to fight new forms of battle with the advent of COVID, which was beyond the health crisis that it generated. The online became the battleground for emerging technologies. UNESCO termed it disinfodemic and identified 9 themes ranging from false information about COVID 19's origin, incidents, symptoms, and cures. This disinformation campaign included the familiar modes of highly emotive narrative constructs, which we all have seen across the internet in forms of memes, in forms of fabricated news, fraudulently altered or decontextualized images and videos. Disinformation infiltrators and orchestrated campaigns, bogus websites, data sets, and sources. Now, imagine states having to battle the health crisis through media ads and public advisories, only to be countered by this highly dangerous campaign undoing their efforts. So, that has been an extremely serious challenge. I would now like to talk about some advanced technologies used by countries to curb COVID outbreak and to manage the pandemic, which raised ethical and privacy concerns as well.
Thank you.
First use was in the area of contact tracing to identify the super spreaders. I think some of you present in this panel or attendees or people listening to us must have received text messages, by the government, which was an intrusive strategy in the beginning. South Korea's Center for Disease Control and Prevention, for example, deployed the contact tracing system known as the COVID 19 Smart Management System that used data from security camera footage, people's credit card records, and even GPS data from cars and cell phones to trace the movement of individuals with COVID 19. So, for people who might have been exposed to COVID 19, notifications were sent to them. Among people who tested positive, those requiring treatment were hospitalized at the COVID 19 special facilities, and those without symptoms were asked to remain self quarantined or for 14 days, or their compliance to was actively monitored. This is how South Korea to contain the spread of COVID 19. But this a lot of questions about intrusiveness, privacy, and data security. The question I think we should be asking ourselves is whether the trade off of privacy for effective COVID-19 control is acceptable to all of us? Has that become the new norm? And are we for coming years going to live with that? There are various areas where AI was used in resource allocation, which was required for battling COVID 19. Predictive modeling allowed medical centers to make better real time decisions concerning treatment of specific cases and resource allocation. So, AI is also used to identify, track, and forecast outbreaks. The better we can track the virus, the better we can fight it. And by analyzing news reports, social media platforms, and government documents, AI can lead to detect an outbreak. AI also can help diagnose the virus. So, artificial intelligence is helping healthcare workers across the globe detect and monitor the disease efficiently. There's this Chinese commerce, all of you must have heard about it, Alibaba. It built an AI powered diagnosis system, which they claim now is 96% accurate at diagnosing the virus in seconds. It no longer take days to wait for your results. Then we have seen the use of drone to deliver medical supplies. I think it has been one of the safest, fastest ways to get medical supplies where they need to go during the disease outbreak so that there is no contact, no human contact at all. Then AI has been used to develop drugs as well across, technologically advanced countries. AI algorithms and its computing power was used to understand the proteins that make up the virus, which further helped develop treatments and build drugs. And we've seen that within weeks of that outbreak, it used its predictive capabilities to propose what already existing drugs were to be useful. Furthermore, there's been progress in advanced fabrics offering protection. So all of us have now become familiarized with using face masks. Now there are face masks out there that are made from antibacterial bacterial fabric that relies on metal oxide nanoparticles. So AI has also been used to identify non-compliance of infected individuals. We have seen videos, I'm sure all of you have seen it, where China's sophisticated surveillance system used facial recognition technology and temperature detection software to identify people who might have a fever and be more likely to be the virus carriers. So, similarly, technology powers smart helmets identified people with fevers. The Chinese government also developed a monitoring system which was called the health code that used big data to identify and assess the risk of each individual. And it's very interestingly was based on their travel history, how much time they spent in virus hotspots, what was the potential exposure to people carrying the virus. So citizens were assigned a color code, which they accessed via popular apps, indicated that if they should be quarantined or allowed in public. Furthermore, we've seen supercomputers working on coronavirus vaccine. The cloud computing resource and supercomputers are used to fast track the development of cure for the vaccine. Risk assessment is another area, forecasting is another area through which artificial intelligence is helping countries find cure and also manage the outbreak. So overall, I think AI is becoming a critical part of healthcare today. The data analytics and the predictive modeling are enabling medical professionals to understand more about the disease. And with the use of AI, more accurate forecasting about the spread of COVID, what type of medication it requires, what type of treatment it requires can be done. Using AI platform, it has become easier for the researchers to quickly find relevant studies. There has been, all of us, again, with the, mask being one, are also now have normalized a gun, temperature gun pointed to our heads or our wrists. These are wireless thermometer guns and other similar infrared body temperature measuring devices that have been used at checkpoints or public places. Now, these technologies assist in measuring body temperature from a distance and turn out to be effective in pinpointing individuals who might need further investigation. Such types of automated thermal monitoring, allowing facial recognition, provides effective measures to detect and then control the disease. UAE has lately developed rapid COVID-19 laser testing technology. So AI has a critical role to play in diagnostic systems because it involves precision, speed, and scale. But the application of big data and AI in contact tracings can be a double-edged sword. How? So, combined with facial recognition technology and big data, sophisticated AIs can pinpoint anyone, anytime, anywhere, and what they have done. So, while it predicts the trajectory of the pandemic and helps governments form response strategies, those who criticize these technologies are concerned about the hackers or governments violating individual privacy or unrightful use, criminal activities, or political surveillance during or after the pandemic. I'll end on this note. While advanced technology is helping countries around the globe manage this outbreak, protecting individual privacy is a real issue. And I'm sure in time that we as global community will find solutions to protect our data too, even if it is under mass surveillance. I look forward to the Q&A. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Rabia. It's a fascinating subject, and I think you mastered it so well. The next speaker is Mr. Javed Jabbar. He will speak on great power competition between China and the United States, a new geopolitical environment. Mr. Javed Jabbar is a former senator of Pakistan and a former federal minister in many cabinets. He is a member of the Senate Forum for Policy Research, and he is a prolific writer. He has written many books. His latest book is What is Pakistaniyat? 41 Elements of the Unique Pakistani National Identity, which is a novel approach at looking at the concept of Pakistaniyat. He is also a media specialist. He is a filmmaker, he's won many awards. And he is also a community mobilizer. He has functioned in thousands of villages in locations across Pakistan. Javed Jabbar.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you, Dr. Masuma Hassan, for your very kind invitation and your gracious introduction. It's a pleasure to participate, and thank you, Dr. Tanveer Khalid, for preparing this event. It's a privilege to be with Dr. Rabia Akhtar, Dr. Nausheen Wasi, and Ms. Hina Jilani. And I've listened with interest to their preceding presentations. They made very pertinent comments. The subject that I have been asked to share some unprecious thoughts on has to do with two specific countries, unlike the preceding presentations, which were broadly global and very pertinent in their nature. And when you look at these two countries, who are certainly relevant to the global world order or disorder by virtue of being the world's two largest economies, the world's two largest militaries. They also, of course, have great contrasts between them, apart from the similarities. What they do has an impact not only within their respective countries, but beyond their shores. That's unmistakable. And in order to look at what is likely to happen over the next 10, 20, 30 years, and it is very difficult to predict the future, that is exactly why I'll talk about it, because I have no idea what will happen. It is necessary to look at the past also to place the future in context. We're talking about two very dissimilar origins in terms of what is China and what is the US. One is truly a historic nation state, thousands of years, the same territory, the same people, virtually the same language across time. And here, on the other hand, we're talking about a country that's barely 400 years old and it is multiracial. It is not homogeneous like China, which is 80% Han Chinese. The United States certainly has a dominant white population, but the projected demographics are looking at a very changed United States in the next 10 to 20 years. And how that will affect America is already beginning to be indicated by the fact that it is likely that a Black woman with South Asian origins will be the first woman vice president of the United States. And that's an indicator of the kind of demographic changes that are likely to affect that country. And in order to see what has happened in the last 2 to 3 decades, it's important to remember that there has been a shift from external polarities of East-West, North-South, communist-capitalist, which defined not only the Cold War, but eras before that. That shift has taken place from externally driven polarities to new internal polarities within countries, political polarization, religious polarization, ethnic, racist polarization. And this has a connection with how those countries behave outside. It has not happened in China, but it has certainly happened in the United States, that its attention has shifted from being an assertive power in a supposedly unipolar world to looking at its own navel. And we see how the 4 years of President Trump have symbolized that. Whereas, of course, in the case of China, we have a situation, unfortunately, where in East Asia with Japan and South Korea, there have been tensions concerning maritime territory and islands. In the South China Sea, there is much greater level of maritime tension with neighbors such as the Philippines and Taiwan and others. Comparatively, the United States has no territorial issues with any of its immediate neighbors. Whether that makes a difference to how cohesively it can act is an unknown, but that's the situation. Looking at how these two countries reacted to the challenge of COVID, what it illustrates is the remarkable weaknesses in these two of the most important, perhaps important is the wrong word, of the two largest economic entities of the world. Initially, China was unwilling to face reality, was slow off the mark, and at great cost to itself and to the rest of the world. But so too America, which is so different from China in many respects, which is supposed to be much more responsive, was also slow off the mark. There is now evidence that President Trump deliberately sidelined, underestimated the threat that had been conveyed to him. And then one wonders, does this have something to do with their respective internal political cultures? On the one hand, the internal political culture of China is very tailor-made for a strong, prompt, effective response to a threat, because it is very centralized. It is a single-party state. You don't have to go around building a consensus. You build a consensus within one party. And the military and the party are synonymous. They should have had, in theory, been able to act very quickly and effectively. On the other hand, of course, in the United States, you have the right opposite. You have a noisy, robust, two-party system. You have media, you have civil society, and you have Chinese singularity, and you have multiplicity in the United States. And did that multiplicity play a role in slowing down the US response? Or was it also the difference in how they view rights as an issue? In China, it is very clear that not just because of communism, but because of historic culture, collective rights are predominant over individual rights. Whereas in the United States, it is individual rights that often overtake collective rights. And that is most evident in the fact that educated, literate Americans, including the president, refused to wear a mask because a mask was supposed to be interfering with your freedom of choice, what you want to do with your body and how you want to behave. So did that have something to do with it? It's perhaps worth thinking about. But when we look at how both countries have evolved in their capacity, and it's particularly relevant from the preceding presentations, in terms of being technologically capable of dealing with new threats, it is important to remember that in the year 2019, China, for the first time, has become the single most innovative country in the world, going by the number of patents filed with the World Intellectual Property Organization. It has actually overtaken the United States for the first time. It has filed applications for over 59,000 new concepts and instruments and technologies. And the US has slipped to 58,000 minus, which is an indicator that despite the other contrasts in these two countries, I mean, America is supposed to be far ahead in terms of education, in terms of experience, both of technology and of the military, how quickly this phenomenon of China leapfrogging from 40 years ago to where it is today. A country which offers startling contrasts in terms of its economic performance. I mean, just take one figure, and perhaps we should not get wrapped up in figures, but it indicates that even as the US continues to be the world's largest economy at $23 trillion GDP nominal, and China in nominal GDP is only about 14 trillion. When you calculate it on a purchasing power parity principle, the figures change. But going by that, one would imagine that the US would obviously be far more possessed and able to handle any kind of challenge to its reserve position, for example. But here in reserves, you have the almost absurd situation that the world's largest economy has only $150 billion worth of dollars, and China has 3 trillion. I mean, there's just no connection between the two. And does this indicate in the years ahead a contrasting capacity to tackle the kind of challenges that we are now facing? Well, there are positive and negative trends, and perhaps it's necessary to quickly run through these. I see 4 disturbing trends in both US and China. In the US, for example, this new chauvinistic internal populism and racism. Second, the intensified partisanship, which is so divisive, best expressed through the forced nomination of a Supreme Court justice, knowing that the election was just 2 weeks away. Third, most disturbingly, the disregard for global treaties, the overturning of commitments, the imposition of sanctions on Iran or Venezuela. And fourth, the fact, and this is not to personalize it unduly, but that 48% of the voters of the United States in the year 2020 have disregarded the fact that their head of state has made 20,000 false statements, documented, so that truth and facts no longer seem to matter. In the case of China, there is cause for concern also. Compared to the past 20 years or so, there is now an increased concentration of power in one person. With the abolition of the term limits for the president of China, which they did about 4 years ago, President Xi Jinping, of course, a great friend of Pakistan, but it is a negative indicator of what has happened. Because when unilateral decision making becomes common in place of consensus building, which has marked the Chinese process for the last 20 years or so, there is then the third problem, which is a reluctance to reverse weak decisions or bad decisions, as in the case of COVID, the failure to act decisively. And for 2 weeks, the president was not visible because if you reverse a bad decision, then the buck stops with the person who is all powerful. Whereas if you have a coalition consensus kind of decision-making process, it is dispersed and shared. And then, of course, the handling of 1 million Muslims in Western China and Xinjiang province is not a very encouraging sign. To balance that, there are 4 positive trends in both countries. One, as demonstrated in the last 72 hours or more, the US remains a robust, transparent democracy. I mean, the sheer pleasure of looking at the fact that votes are being counted, unheard of in countries like ours or even India, where they do not allow cameras into places where votes are being counted. The second, a reluctance to intervene overseas, which is very welcome considering the devastations that America caused in Iraq and Afghanistan. Third, it's still the largest free market. It offers an opportunity to entrepreneurs and exporters. And fourth, it is a refreshingly open society, perhaps at some point too open, but it is vigorously open. The 4 positive things one sees in China, which will help shape the future, is that it remains, despite being a single-party state, a thoroughly meritocracy-based system, where it doesn't matter which family you come from, how much money you have, as long as you meet the very tough criteria of the Communist Party, anyone can progress to the very top. That is not true of the United States, where money makes the mayor go. You cannot work in the political process without big bucks. The second positive thing, much better than America's track record, is that China has always had, contemporary China, a non-interventionist approach, particularly the military approach. Third, its economy is adapting with remarkable speed and finesse. Already, the factory of the world, China was called the factory of the world about 20 years ago, 10 years ago. And last year, their exports are now only 20% of GDP. They are shifting towards domestic consumption to stimulate growth in the future, knowing that countries are becoming protectionist, America particularly, they're preparing for that very well. And even though they retain strong Communist Party dominance, there is a much greater use of global media and internally their own social media to allow connectivity and communication. So how do we look at, and I'll conclude in the next 2 or 3 minutes. Do we think that 2 major powers can cooperate on issues like COVID, even as they have tension and conflict in the South China Sea or on other aspects? This will build because America has openly opposed China's remarkable Belt and Road Initiative, which embraces 70 countries, spans even South America, Africa, the Middle East, the Far East. This is bound to create tension. And yet, the reality is that in the last 30, 40 years, the world has become interdependent in an extremely comprehensive and complex manner. And that interdependence will survive even Trump's disregard of the climate accord or its rejection of the Iran accord. This interdependence is now an enduring factor. And therefore, one ends on the hopeful note that the next 10 to 20 years will see greater cooperation, both on a global multilateral level, as well as on a regional, perhaps trans-Pacific level between China, possibly because a new president with a very different mindset is going to be elected. And a president in America has much greater leeway in reshaping foreign policy than many other heads of state do. And certainly China doesn't have that restriction. And then also on the bilateral level, directly, because though trade is no guarantee that there will be no conflict, both countries invest in each other, both countries exchange people. Though there is a great asymmetry, there are 400,000 Chinese students in America studying, and there are only 11,000 American students studying in China. There is that asymmetry, but there is also constant interaction. So let me conclude by saying that I see these two countries managing conflict in a non-violent way. They will growl at each other, they will glower at each other like two beasts that snarl at each other, but they will respect each other's size and importance and avoid outright violent military conflict, even if India does its very best to promote it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jabbar sir. On this note of hope, I wish to thank you. I hope your optimism works out. And the last speaker, I have, with great pleasure, I would like to invite Hina Jilani Sahab to address us. I believe the first remember that we invited her to speak when we celebrated 70 years of our existence in the few years ago. But for some reason she had to travel and she couldn't attend that conference. And she will speak on broadening human security concerns, especially violence against women in the post-COVID world. She is a well-known human rights lawyer, human rights activist. She has been the founder of the Human Rights Commission of Pakistan, of the Women's Action Forum, and of Pakistan's first legal aid center in 1986. She has been involved with the United Nations Center for Human Rights. For many years, she was the United Nations Special Representative of the Secretary General on Human Rights Defenders. And lately, she has been named as the recipient, that is this year, of the 2020 Stockholm Human Rights Award. She is also a member of the eminent jurist panel on terrorism, counterterrorism, and human rights. Hina Jilani Sahiba, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Dr. Masuma, and thank you, Tanveer Khalid, also for taking this initiative, for bringing us together and for our being able to share many of our thoughts that we have gathered over the past 6-7 months since we've been in a situation which we have never before been in. I'm also very honored to be on the same panel as Nausheen, Bushra, Nausheen and Rabia, and especially my old friend Javed, Jabbar. Because I learned a lot today from what you are saying, and many of the cobwebs that I always feel are in my mind on some issues were happily cleared away. On the COVID crisis, I think there are so many aspects of this crisis that we have to look at, and so much to say in many ways, so much to lament, but also much to reflect upon and see where this can lead us into a better world. I have now come to the conclusion that this COVID-19 is not just a health crisis. It is a human rights crisis. And we have seen how different rights have been so severely impacted. And in that impact, we see not just the risk that we have in terms of, mm, not being able to prevent violations or not being able to preserve the respect for these rights, but there is also an opportunity now, if anybody is willing to take it, to correct much of what we have neglected in the past. I think the foremost thing that comes to my mind at this point is how weak the world is, whether it's the developed or the less developed or the underdeveloped world, on social security nets. And that is something that has come so overwhelmingly as a sense to most people over here, where free employment potential has been affected, the right to work obviously has been affected, rising prices, everything. It was now in many ways, in the early days of the COVID lockdowns, it was a matter of survival for many people in the world. Now, the problem that I see is not just the issues that arose with respect to how to survive physically and the kind of struggle that people were going through, but also the psychological impact that not just the struggle for survival was taking on us, the toll it was taking on us, but also that this kind of social isolation was also very affecting us very badly, in the sense that the usual social support systems that we turn to was suddenly not that available for us. And it took some time for us to realize that there are people around us who are willing to help. And the state, of course, was in many cases, states generally and governments were slow to react. I don't blame them that much. This is the first time that this kind of a humongous crisis had landed on their laps. And especially in countries where there is a limitation on resources, governments suddenly felt that this was an overwhelming task and were late to react. At the same time, I think what was worrying also for us was that though this crisis had a global dimension, multilateral system was not able to respond the way it should have responded. And I agree with Nausheen that it is not the crisis that fragmented the multilateral cohesion, but it was the fragmentation that affected our response, or the multilateral response to this particular global crisis. We have been watching this waning of the multilateral system. And many people, much before this crisis came, were warning that when this kind of a crisis comes, the weakness of the multilateral system and the kind of political commitment that has weakened over the years to support this system and accept it and recognize its potential is going to harm us more than in the normal times. So I think this is something that I totally agree with Nausheen, and I do believe that this has done its harm and it has been able to affect negatively the way that we could respond to it. I will now come to the lessons that we can learn and move forward in a better way. Now, we keep saying this is the new normal, but given what we have confronted and what during this period of COVID and maybe for some time to come seems to us the normal, I hope that it will not be. I hope that this is not the new normal. I only hope that we emerge with a better understanding how to order our lives, how to readjust our priorities, and make sure that we give attention to the more marginalized and the most vulnerable in terms of setting our priorities, both at the global level and at the national level. But I also think that it is important that there has to be a global response with more cohesion, more coordination, more sympathy for those who need resources. But also, I think we need to recognize that there are more stakeholders than just the victims and the governments. I think one of the least appreciated sector of the society that has come forward and contributed significantly is the civil society. And this is something we cannot ignore. The civil society, both at the international level and at the national level, has stepped up to make its contributions. These contributions have to be recognized, and the whole civil society internationally and nationally has to be recognized as a stakeholder in every lesson that we learn and in every initiative that we undertake after those lessons have become clearer. One of the things that, of course, is now staring us in the face is this visibility of social inequalities. And this has really come as something that was never absent, but it was less recognized than it is today. Globally, I think on the women's issue, for instance, there has been a lot of emphasis on how women suffered, especially in the context of gender-based violence during the COVID period, and how we as policymakers or framers of initiatives, designers of initiatives, are we now going to learn from those lessons and be sure that the gaps that we have identified will be effectively filled so that we can not only give protection, but give protection with dignity, and make sure that when women are given protection and protection measures and systems are evolved anywhere in the world at the national level, we are able to make sure that there is a human rights approach towards protection, and that women are given protection without taking away their other fundamental rights, for instance, the right to liberty or the freedom of movement or the autonomy in making a choice. So, and giving them the agency to make that choice. In the context of the marginalization of people, I think that during the COVID period, in the kind of chaos and confusion that we faced and the tremendous task of fulfilling people's need to survival, women were forgotten. And we forgot that there is out there a sizable number of people, women, who are now going to suffer because of the lockdowns, because of the social isolation, because of the fact that their freedom of movement is so restricted that they cannot access forums of justice, for instance, or mechanisms of complaint or mechanisms for getting remedy and relief and protection. I run a shelter in Lahore, and this was something that is something I have learned firsthand on what the difficulties that women face during this time. But it's not just women. Remember that when we speak about gender-based violence, we are talking about gender. And I'm very well aware of the increased discrimination and neglect of other sexual minorities, especially the transgender community, in both in access to healthcare, access to justice, access to any kind of services. There is this element of discrimination which we must understand and realize if we are talking about gender. Gender is not just women. But if you are talking about women, for instance, at the international level, I think a lot has been said. But what has been said has not been supported as it should have been by evidence. And that necessarily indicates that we are still lagging behind in data collection and documentation, which would help us not only to establish the fact that there is a serious concern with regard to gender-based violence during the COVID situation and other civil emergencies when they happen. I think obsession with COVID has to transcend just this present pandemic. What we should prepare ourselves is for other civil emergencies as well. So I think it's best to understand that there has to be an evidence base for us to be able to not only better analyze what our needs are and what our gaps are, but also to be able to make effective systems that will take away the gaps and give the necessary relief that we think we should be giving for women. Now, in the context of this whole question of impact on freedoms, if you notice, there have been a lot of collective protests by people who have been affected. There have been protests by communities because of lack of amenities and diminishing space for them even to go and access those amenities. People have been talking about rising prices, health workers, medical personnel, students. People have protested. Who has not been able to make their problems and their plights visible in a collective manner are women survivors of gender-based violence. And this is something that we must understand, that the state response to the right to protest is also impacts on how chilling effect it can have on those who are even more vulnerable to organize themselves and to come forward in an organized, peaceful manner to show and make visible the problems that they are being subjected to. So I think it's important that we remember the inability of gender-based victims of gender-based violence to even show collectively how they have been particularly affected by these situations. Now, as I said, at the international level, a lot is being said. But what will, in fact, show that what is being said is not only true, but how it has to be dealt with will be from information that is collected, that is documented at the national level. So here, I think the national level and the local level really becomes important. And I think in the beginning, it was already said that what kind of effect is it having on communities, families, etc. So I think all of us now realize that communities and families have been affected in a way in which in many instances it will change relationships. It will change relationships in the domestic sphere or even in the community. There have been positive and negative trends, both. But in terms of our being able to deal with gender-based violence, we have seen that we failed women in this respect. I remember when this COVID crisis started, all the Darul Amans and all crisis centers closed their doors to women. I think Dastak was the only center that remained open, although there were a lot of challenges. But some kind of SOPs were set up so that women are not turned away. But the stream of women that we normally get, we didn't get during the COVID crisis. Obviously, because there was less ability of women to access information or to be able to move out of the home, even when they were subjected to gender-based violence. On the other hand, we must also remember that there are now formal systems, protection systems in almost all the 4 provinces. So there are women protection systems. This COVID crisis has shown us how dysfunctional they are and how fragile their ability to stay effective during an emergency like the COVID pandemic. We saw that these dysfunctional systems, already dysfunctional systems, totally disintegrated. And no one was able to utilize these systems that remain now on paper. So I do believe that there are many, many things, many lessons that we have learned from this crisis that we are confronting. In some ways, I believe that the society in general, and especially the civil society, organized civil society, was able to respond quickly because they didn't have to mobilize a huge machinery like governments have to before they could effectively and visibly be able to show that they have reacted and are there to give not just help, but also solace to the citizenry. I think it's important that what we have seen is now collective in terms of what happened that was positive, what happened that was negative, and how the most vulnerable and the most marginalized now should be the focus of our attention in terms of not just giving civil and political rights to them, but also make sure that from the oldest to the youngest, the right to health, the right to education, the right to participate in decision making, so that the framers are aware that sometimes sitting on their thrones, they are not able to see the realities on the ground, and the more mistakes they make and the delay that comes in correcting those mistakes costs people's lives. And it's not just actual life or prevention of death, it's also life in terms of the quality of life and the suffering that people undergo while mistakes are being made and then mistakes are being corrected. So I just want to say here at the end that look, the virus does not discriminate, but its impacts do discriminate. The virus is the same for everyone, but how it impacts and how the world and national leadership responds to this will discriminate against people. So always remember that start with the most vulnerable and make sure that nobody is left behind. Otherwise, there is very little for us to pat our backs about and applaud our efforts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hina. Thank you very much for this very insightful statement which you've made. And now I will open the floor to questions. If there are any questions, I'm sure the panelists will be very happy to answer.
Thank you, distinguished speakers, for sharing your valuable views with us and making this a thought-provoking session.
Would the first
Dr. Rabia Akhtar would like to say
just a minute, Pushpa. First, I'd like to ask the panelists if they want to ask questions of each other, because I thought Rabia wanted to say something.
No, sorry, you opened the floor, so I was just referring to a question that was posed to me in the Q&A here. So
okay, go ahead. No, you go ahead. Answer
okay, okay, all right. So this question is by Ahmed Raza Saab, and he's talking to me about this. Rockefeller Foundation published a report in 2010, 10 years earlier. It was called Scenarios for the Future of Technology and International Development. And this document was a 54-page document, and it sort of correctly predicted as to how the world will be shaped, not only the world, but also the individuals societies, and what type of technology would be needed. I would like to, ask this question, and I do this exercise with my students as well. Why do you think Rockefeller Foundation was able to correctly predict scenarios as to how the world would, shape, and what technologies in the future would save the world? Scenario planning is an extremely important tool for strategic planning. It is a very, very powerful approach. There are so many variables that are interacting variables and that are unpredictable. How many times we in Pakistan have engaged with our imagination? How many times, how many publications are out there that you can point to me that are published in Pakistan that have done scenario planning on population growth, let's say 10 years, 5, 10 years down the road, and how will Pakistan deal with that? Water, climate change scenarios, energy resources, how Pakistan is going to deal with that, or disease related. There are none. I'll just give you a very small example as to why we're afraid to do scenario planning. There was this I think a decade back or more so, Pakistan Nuclear Regulatory Authority had published an advertisement for public awareness, which had the sign of radiation in the middle. It was in Urdu, and it was published in the newspaper, and it was said कि अगर आपको ये sign कहीं नजर आए तापकारी का radiation का, तो प्लीज ये जो लॉस्ट आइटम्स हैं इनके बारे में आप हमें इंफॉर्मेशन दीजिए. And the when this advertisement came out, there was a huge unnerving in the government about कि जी दुनिया क्या कहेगी कि पाकिस्तान से कोई materials lose हो गए हैं. That is why they have published this ad in the newspaper. So ये तो हम लोगों का mindset है कि हम लोग scenario planning नहीं कर सकते because हम डरते हैं as to what the world is going to say about it. आपके civil defense nuclear planning के ऊपर कोई scenario building नहीं हो सकती because you cannot go there. It's a no-go area. So why the developing world do you think is so predictable? Because we don't engage with our imagination. West does, and it predicts us so correctly. So we can sit here and we can talk about a world order that is being engineered by the West or foundations like Rockefeller, and or we have a choice. We can make ourselves unpredictable by thinking for ourselves and our future by doing scenario planning and making it a part of strategic policy approach, which is missing at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Ravi. Ji, Bushra, you can go ahead.
Thank you, madam. The second question is, acknowledging to what Mr. Javed Jabbar has presented, I still maintain that the US deliberately resorted to conflict escalation with China to benefit their military industry complex, which holds strong support from the US Congress and Senate. Where do you find Pakistan in this entire scenario? Please guide.
Should I respond, Dr. Masuma?
Yes, please.
Thank you for that question. The role of the military-industrial complex in the United States is a historical reality, and certainly the kind of words and attitudes of the outgoing president, hopefully outgoing president of the United States, has reinforced that with the kind of arms sales he was very keen to make to Saudi Arabia and others. Yes, that is one aspect of it. But I don't think, to be fair, I don't think that that was the sole or dominant motive, because China does not represent an outright military threat in terms of technology. It is certainly double the strength of the United States personnel. The US has about 1.4 million people in its armed forces. China has 2.8 million. And of course, its population is that much bigger. It is what the United States apprehends with China is its multi-dimensional emergence. Not the military is part of it, but not the most worrisome. The United States today has 800 bases around the world. By bases, I don't mean the huge base they have in Qatar or the naval base they have in Bahrain. They can have 200 people somewhere conducting military-related work. 800 bases. Even when they've decided to withdraw from Afghanistan, they've decided to withdraw from Iraq, they maintain a very effective global presence. They're in South Korea at the very doorstep of China with nuclear weapons. China, in contrast, actually has one military base, one in Djibouti, near the Gulf near the Red Sea, one base. And the United States understands that China does not represent an immediate military threat to the US. It represents economic as well as geopolitical influence through the Belt and Road Initiative. It is not going to be driven by military ambition as much as building new sets of relationships. And I'm reminded of how Deng Xiaoping said it so perceptively amongst so many other things he did. He said, hide your strength, bide your time. And the Chinese are biding their time. Biding their time not by secretly building up a military arsenal that will threaten America outright. It's just developing it to its full potential. Now, where does Pakistan come into this? I think sometimes in the past, we have shown a remarkable capacity to manage a positive relationship with China, even while being a member of two military pacts whose sole purpose was to contain communism, Seato and Cento. So way back in the 50s, 60s, we were able to walk the tightrope of a very progressive relationship with China, and at the same time, up to 1965 at least, if not even up to 1970, we have to remember that Pakistan played a pivotal role, which is not often acknowledged, in how the US policy to China went through a 180-degree shift when we facilitated the secret dialogue of Kissinger with Mao Zedong. So I think it represents a challenge for us to maintain cordial and constructive relations with the United States. It's far too important a country for us to become immediately or progressively alienated from it. But we should be less abject. We should be less willing to surrender some modicum of national dignity and capacity, and make them conscious of the fact that we are able to mobilize our own internal resources rather than always be dependent on the IMF or the World Bank or the White House's patronage. So it's a challenge for geopolitical strategy in Pakistan and our diplomacy. And I hope that we respond to that challenge.
Okay, Bushra.
Okay, so the next question is, this question is from Mr. Kaleem Faruqi, and this is directed to Mr. Javed Jabbar. However, I request all the panelists to share their views on the question. The question is, while the tug of war between US and China goes on, and we will see much of it in the future, what do you think will be the role of India being supported by US for policing our region? Has India isolated itself in the region it hoped to dominate?
Dr. Masuma, I think Nausheen Wasi would be very well placed to respond.
Nausheen, आप respond करें. Nausheen.
Thank you very much, Madam and Jabbar Sahab. आपने मुझे मौका दिया. I do not think India is isolated in this situation. Because you see, India is part of the new alignment that is taking place in the region. United States is cultivating India versus China in the region, and India finds itself in that alignment fit for its interest, because it is it's not having good relations with China. It's also the time-long relationship between the two, which is marked with distrust. And it's overt a manifestation we saw during the crisis we just had a few months back between China and India. People say that India is on the wrong side of the history. because they see China emerging on the global scene sooner or later. So you see, if you are talking about from that perspective, you might see India being isolated, but I do not think at the moment India is. And then, all right, there are assumptions that China would lead the world, but these are assumptions, and there is still a long way China is to tread. So let future decides. I do not think at the moment India is isolated.
I would,
Javed,
I
would
would
you
say
like to add to that?
very briefly, I think Nausheen Sahaba has said it well. I only think that India should not be either underestimated or
True.
exaggeratedly seen as a potent factor always. I think we need to take a balanced view of India, and we need to remember that just as Trump has been rejected so decisively, in India, we must always remember that the majority of Indian voters voted against the BJP. There is another segment of India which represents the real India. It is fragmented, it is splintered between various parties, and because they cannot unite, uh, this single terrible Hindutva element has emerged because of the first past the post system. But India will certainly try to ensure that every inch of its territory which it claims will be protected. Whether it succeeds is another matter, but neither is it in China's interests to take it to the next level of outright military conflict, because India will never be able to, of course, match China's resources. Uh, the tension will continue, even if they resolve the line of actual control issue, which they are currently contesting. The sheer fact that two very large countries, two of the most populous countries of the world, are in the same continent is inevitably going to lead to a kind of, if not destructive, a kind of creative tension. How do you manage two huge characters where there are several other on the periphery, which, of course, the favorite being Pakistan, which has an excellent relationship with China. So the China India relationship will have to also take into account the Pakistan factor, which will remain a potent determinant of how that bilateral relationship works out.
Would anybody else like to respond to that? We can go to the next question, Bushra.
Okay, the next question is, we see that a new wave of COVID-19 is surging, especially in Europe. What should we assume? The virus is either man-made or a naturally occurring one. Thank you.
Nausheen, would you like to speak?
Thank you, madam.
Do you think
Yes,
it's man? You've always been a supporter of conspiracy theories.
actually, in that case, yes, I take interest. In fact, I am guiding one of the researchers that says that virus is natural, but pandemic is political. So let's see what outcome is of that research. Conspiracies theories are always there, and one of my favorite book is Dependence and Punishment, that was written in 1975 by Michel. And then we talk about the Foucault's theory of power and knowledge. Basically, that says that we consider change as something natural and rational outcome of the technological changes that take place, or the rational discourses that take place over the period of time, but it is guarded. So in that way, certain things you see are just thrown to check what happens, how the world responds, to me. And it has always been conspiracy theory has always been associated with different events in history. Same was the case with 9/11. But you see, to me, this is not important. This is not important whether it was natural or a laboratory made virus. Because you see, I am interested in the impact that any event or the situation like this carries. You see, virus, whether it is natural or man-made, affects lives. It is triggering impact, and we all are to deal with the situation and the subsequent developments that it led to. And this cannot be controlled. This can be manipulated to an extent, but not beyond that. So you see, many things come out of it naturally, and we are to deal with it. So we need to prepare for it. If we'll keep on ignoring, and if we'll keep ourselves in the denial mode, we are on to be the receiving end. So you see, we see the developments, we see the trends around us, and then we act accordingly. This adaptability to the situation is very important. So you see, I think it's not when we discuss the political implications of this pandemic, basically we are dealing with the impact, and this impact is very real. We cannot deny it. So to me, it's more important to focus on this instead of exploring whether it is natural or man-made. That's my take on this. Thank you.
हिना, आप कुछ कहना चाहेंगी इस पर?
Gee, I think Nausheen has really hit the nail on the head. I have always believed that instead of chasing conspiracy theories, you deal with the problem that you are now confronting, wherever the virus comes from a laboratory or from the nature. The point is that this is affecting our lives. Now, I think the virus may be natural, but the chaos around it is always man-made.
Javed, आप कुछ कहेंगे? Javed, would you like to respond?
I think both women have
Do you think
done.
it's man-made?
Certainly. No, it is man-made in the sense that it is a symptom of how we have terribly disregarded the sanctity of nature by encouraging crossing other red lines. We have consumed animal flesh without realizing what the consequences can be. So, in that sense, it is due to man's ravaging appetite for nature, regardless of what should be respected and not respected. So, only to that extent, but I do not believe that some scientists got into a laboratory and invented a virus and then secretly exported it from America into China or from China into the US in order to spread it. What we have is an absolutely natural consequence of man's disrespect for nature.
I personally think it's just the revenge of nature to what we have done to this beautiful planet and to all the species which nature is even now evolving. And we are even now discovering new species.
Yes.
But we have just devastated everything.
True.
Bushra, is there another question?
Yes, ma'am, there are a few more questions. And my
Okay.
next question is, do you think this pandemic would have an impact on the current US presidential elections?
That's too late now.
It's already had an impact. I mean, you can see the result. My God. I mean, the world's most advanced country has said there's nothing to really be pleased about. What a tragedy that the highest number of casualties are in America. The largest number of new cases are being discovered in America 6-7 months after the acknowledgement of this. I mean, what does this represent? As I said earlier, an basic inherent flaw at the heart of a huge system, which is otherwise supposed to be so productive and focused and efficient. My God, it has revealed the vulnerability and the inadequacies and the weaknesses of that system. And I'm not deriding democracy. What is distressing to me is that even in a system which is open, democratic, accountable, visible to everyone, you can still get away with either sheer neglect or monumental incompetence or disregard for collective rights and just say, no, I'm not going to wear a mask and I'm going to attend these rallies and I'm not. which of course, mashallah, Pakistan is not too far behind that in attending these rallies. But by some miracle, because God is always on our side, we have nowhere near the same rate of infection as the United States. So we are doing the right thing sometimes in Pakistan.
Bushra, go ahead.
Okay, my next question is directed to Ms. Hina Jilani. As you highlighted your concerns that are prevalent in our society since centuries, how far has the government of Pakistan and civil societies have progressed or contributed towards better human rights, especially welfare of women in Pakistan? Thank you.
I think where we were in the 1980s when the most recent and energetic women's movement started, I think we've come a long way. And however, I must say regretfully that it has been despite governments rather than because of them. And I think it's really because of civil society actors and the women's rights movement and the energy that they generated and the pressure that they used, which became the real leverage for some action that was taken in terms of legislation. However, much of what we have gained is still remains paper victory. And I think the implementation and the functionalization or operationalization of the legal mechanisms that have been created is still something that we have to achieve. I don't think that women have really benefited from the legislation that we did so much to gain over the years. As I said in my presentation, there are women protection systems that have been created by legislation, but most of these are dysfunctional. On the
We've
other
got
hand,
two questions from.
on the other hand, I think it's also important to remember that every legislation will only have an impact if the social policy of the state supports the laws that have a social implication. And in the case of women's rights, I don't think this state, whether it's one government or the other, has had ever the commitment or the intention to back everything by social policy, because the state has fostered, in fact, a mindset that has become the biggest impediment for the removal of many cultural practices that need to be done away with if women are to progress in this country.
If I may add, I agree entirely with Hina Jilani regarding the need for the state and government to back up promises with hard social policy that is implemented not just by the federation but in each of the 4 provinces, because we still have unspeakably primitive practices being conducted not just amongst the rural illiterate households, mashallah, in the cities where we are supposed to have a more educated level, we have these islands and fairly large islands of primitivism and barbarism that erupt from time to time. One silver lining, which I think has occurred, and it is inconvenient to, of course, say that it occurred. It's an inconvenient truth because it occurred during a military dictator's rule, of which I was privileged to be a part for some time. But when General Musharraf introduced 17% reserved seats for women in all the legislatures at the federal and provincial level, and 33% at the local level, even though the local government system has not been sustained, has been mutilated and reduced, the sheer visibility of women, their active participation in the political process, even if many of them were nominees, signifies the other change that is taking place in Pakistan. The increased participation of women in the labor force, in the cities, in colleges, in universities, in banking, in teaching, in medicine. My God, the visibility of women. And of course, all you have to do is to go to a talk show in the evening and they want to have a woman host. Many of them want to have a woman host a talk show. So I am consoled only by this, that whereas there is this terrible deficit in lack of social policy and implementation of social policy, the visibility of women. And there's an awesome visibility in this very webinar. I mean, us poor men are intimidated by the host, by these three other speakers. I'm in a minority. I am so, oppressed already that I feel encouraged. Women are advancing all the time, and may that continue.
I don't
will-
think, Javed, you should feel oppressed at all. I think men and women take forward the nation together. The only thing is that sometimes you recognize the men and their contribution and ignore what women are doing, although they are continuously contributing and are in places where they have been able to make a lot of difference to the not just the social and economic situation in this country, but also the political dispensation of this country. But I will give you one thing. Look, you're right that there was a time when certain dictators have come forward and brought legislation. You know, Ayub Khan brought the Family Laws Ordinance in 1961. But the problem here is that people forget that the dictator may have brought it, but there were women behind that struggle all the time. 1961 ordinance didn't come just because you wanted to bring it in. Women's pressure was there at that time. Even during Musharraf time, it helped him to bring something that the women had been pressing for a long time. Our struggles don't stop when military interventions take place. Our struggles go on, and the dictators probably feel pressured to find a constituency to give them more legitimacy. But I will concede this. Okay, the dictator did it. 100 गुनाहों में एक अच्छाई अगर हो भी जाए तो चले, उसको भी मान लेते हैं.
He had a very good cabinet secretary also, who was a woman.
Thank you. Thank you. We have two questions from very senior members of the Institute. Mr. S.M. Fazal is our treasurer, and he has a question. Don't you think there should be collective international response through the United Nations to such a situation in the light which is more satisfactory than the one which we probably received from WHO? The poor and what is it further? The poor and developing countries are in a frightful position in the pandemic. Would you like to answer, Javed?
Well, thank you. I think
international response.
There is a degree of international response. It is not ideal. It is not coherent. It is not effective, as we saw how WHO also stumbled, and WHO's capacity was badly dented because of the most inappropriate decision by President Trump to withdraw financial support to WHO and threatening WHO. However, on the credit side, the overwhelming bulk of nation states support WHO. They cooperate with WHO. So we should not disregard the role that WHO already plays. What is needed now is political action through the United Nations to give this strength and substance, because instead of, as Hina Jilani said, it's not just a health issue, it's a human rights issue. So you need a political approach, not in the partisan sense, but a truly comprehensive political approach, which should come through the General Assembly, should come through the Security Council, where the 5 veto powers should not use a veto to block any attempt to give new meaning to what does it mean to cooperate internationally to create a proper post-COVID-19 situation. Because back in 2015, there were warnings. We cannot claim that we were caught off guard. When the SARS epidemic took place, there were a number of epidemiologists and scientists who cautioned, who wrote research papers and said, these are the things we need to do now within the US, within Europe, within multilateral bodies. And those were disregarded. They were not given the priority that they deserve. So certainly there's a lot to be done internationally. And I think Pakistan should play its part in leading such initiatives on a regional as well as on a global level. And I'm sure others will add to whatever this.
May I add something here, madam?
Nausheen?
Madam, United Nations did come up with a response. On 25th June, it came up with comprehensive response to COVID-19 document that talks about delivering a global response that leaves no one behind, reduces our vulnerability to future pandemics, build resilience to future shocks, and above all climate change, and overcome the severe and systematic inequalities exposed by the pandemic. The problem is that you see in United Nations, because you see countries chose to take the nationalists action and they do not bind themselves to the international agreements because they feel are deprived of their due development opportunities in the global political and economic scenario. They do not act accordingly. What happened, for example, when Germany came up with this eco-revolution policies, the other European states did not accept to agree to those measures because they wanted to continue with the traditional mode of energy in order to gain prosperity before they adopt too expensive modes of dealing with the economic process and production things. So you see, it is not United Nations, it is not the United Nations, but nations in the UN that makes its policies fail. So we need to look this from that approach as well. It is the power politics that dominates, and United Nations unfortunately does not have binding authority on the individual states. So there is actually there needs to be change in the institutional mechanism of the United Nations, and that I do not see in pictures. So we will come up with the very good documents but with very poor implementation. That is the problem. There is documentation but implementation has been a problem. Madam,
May
can
I
I
Can
add
we have only, thank you,
very
Nausheen,
briefly?
we have only, जी बोल रही हैं? We
Can I
have,
just add very briefly to what Nausheen has said, a little disagreeing with her to a very slight extent. Yes, it is the member states that really make the policies at the UN, and we are in a very difficult multilateral system where we have to talk about the shortcoming of governments to the governments and expect them to allay our fears and concerns. They will not do that. But at the same time, there is within the United Nations a leadership that we look towards. And I think the Secretary General here could have done much more than he did in terms of showing leadership. And I do really believe that he failed to use the potential of the UN to its fullest extent. In protecting the WHO or attacks against that came against it, I think he should have done more on that and on other issues as well. So I do believe that yes, there is always this problem with this multilateral system in the UN, but at the same time, there are other actors within the UN who could, in some ways, at least draw the attention, draw people together to talk about things more seriously than the current Secretary General has been able to do.
there is another question from a senior member of the Institute whom many of you would know, Agha Masood Hussain. He has raised, yes, he has raised a question. It's true that the US and China will not come in direct conflict with each other, but there are agent provocators who will push conflict or who can push conflict, like India has done in Ladakh. Javed sir.
Yes, certainly. I mean, India's outrageous annexation of Kashmir evokes the horrendous fact that Russia has got away with the annexation of Crimea. I mean, purely because of the size of a state, these large states become predatory states. And India is a classic example of a predatory state that from its very birth has been expanding its territory. And the role of the agent provocateur, which you refer to, it doesn't need to be anyone else's agent provocateur because it is itself willing to be its own agent provocateur. It has expanded its territory. Its actual relationship with virtually all its immediate neighbors is extremely negative. Formally, poor little Bhutan may not say it publicly, but Bhutan can't lift a finger on its foreign policy or open a high commission, an embassy anywhere without the explicit consent of the Ministry of External Affairs in New Delhi. Maldives similarly, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh. In Bangladesh the other day, it was appalling to learn that the Indian Foreign Secretary arrives at Dhaka airport without even the courtesy of an advance notice to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the government of Bangladesh, immediately demands an interview with the Bangladesh Prime Minister. Fortunately, Bangladesh stands its ground and refuses his access. So he has to deal with the Foreign Minister and the Foreign Secretary. This kind of arrogant attitude, coupled with the annexation of Kashmir, which they are deluded enough to think will be enduring, what role will India play in provoking a China-US outright confrontation? I have reservations and doubts, because I think when it comes to the crunch, both China and the US will have to measure the costs and the potential benefits. And they are reasonably well schooled. Of course, a crucial determinant in how states behave is who exactly is the decision maker. The personality, the mindset of the particular leader where the buck stops can make a vital difference, can make a tremendous difference to how states also behave. So it depends on who is in charge of the US at a given time and who is in charge in China at a given time. And I think there are enough checks and balances built into both systems, despite what I said that in recent years in China, there has been a very disturbing tendency to concentrate power in the hands of one man alone. Despite that, they are also astute enough to realize that they should not use power, not needlessly, but without very careful discretion. And China has got a very mature record of when and how to use power. Look at the South China Sea. They know that the United States deliberately sends aircraft carriers and battleship destroyers in order to provoke a Chinese reaction. But Chinese reaction is so carefully modulated that they make their presence felt, and yet they avoid outright confrontation with a vessel. So it's part of China's much more mature, well-considered strategy, the result of hundreds, thousands of years of evolution.
Sure. Well, we've got only 2 or 3 minutes left, so I'm going to wrap up this absolutely interesting and insightful session, and thank all the panelists for their contribution. I'd like to say that we have focused or tried to focus not on whether the virus was man-made or whether it was natural, but on the impact it has had on our lives and on the world. Nausheen has said very, very forcefully that she didn't think that there was a fragmentation as a result of this pandemic, a fragmentation of the world order. The contribution made by Rabia Akhtar was fascinating in terms of technologies, which was something I learned a great deal about. And she has focused not only on the details of how this technology has been used and can be used even for the better during the pandemic, not only to monitor, but that it has also the dimension that it can be intrusive so far as privacy is concerned, and it can unfortunately be used for political surveillance. Javed Jabbar Saab has come out with a very strong presentation on the standoff, or likely, unlikely, between China and the US. And he has dwelt forcefully on the ways in which the two countries have responded to the pandemic, to the COVID-19 pandemic, to the disparities in their approaches, and the contrasting capacity to meet the challenges. But he has ended on a very optimistic note, and he sees and he hopes that the conflict will be managed between them in a non-violent way. And Hina Jilani Sahiba has said it all when she has said that this is just not a health crisis, but also a human rights crisis, and how it has thrown up how weak is the world on social security, and how it has exposed even better the lack of equality, social equality between different, maybe regions, people, communities, societies. She has also talked about a weak multilateral response. And she has also said that this has given us an opportunity to order our lives better in the future, has also identified the real stakeholders in this battle which we are facing today. I'd like to say that many countries, or some countries, at least in Europe, have developed mechanisms in which women can, in view of domestic violence during the pandemic, domestic abuse, reach out to the state or to social societies for help. I don't think that there is any such move in our own country, and she has underlined how this pandemic and the lockdowns especially, which lead to lack of freedom of movement, have also made it difficult for women to access courts of law or help in any manner whatsoever. So I'd like to thank all the panelists for something that I've learned from each one of you. And I'm very grateful that you have taken the time to be with us. And I hope that when in future we are able to organize more webinars, I hope we will be out of the frame of webinars soon and we can have a real live meeting. But as long as we do have webinars, I hope we can hear you again and again and again. Thank you very much.
It's our honor, madam. We are truly honored. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and goodbye to everyone. Thank you, Dr.
Goodbye.
Masooma. Thank you, all the PIIA and my fellow panelists. Goodbye.
Bye.
Khuda Hafiz.
Thank
Allah Hafiz.
you. All the best.